Please welcome Chief Executive Officer of the Barack Obama Foundation, Valerie Jarrett. President and Chief Executive Officer of the Kresge Foundation, Rapson. And welcome back to the stage, Suzanne, Shank.
I'm so excited. We are so honored to welcome Valerie Jarrett to the main stage. Your first time on Mackinac Island?
First time on Mackinac, but I did, thank you. I was gonna say, but I did spend 3 years at the University of Michigan, so go blue.
Yeah. Great. And we're looking forward to hearing your wisdom from your just dynamic career as White House advisor, city, corporate, and nonprofit leader. Here in Michigan, we've been working hard on how to increase our talent pool, attract more population within our borders. We've explored ways to grow jobs, bring new industry, expand access to opportunity, something I think you know a lot about. But we know from your work is that you have economic growth and development cannot sit in a silo. From the ingenuity and leadership of committed, engaged, and empowered citizenry, supported by a strong infrastructure that strengthens and amplifies their voice. We know that our theme, Bridging the Future Together, requires a strong civic infrastructure that draws in the public, private, and social sectors to a civic problem-solving table. It requires building coalitions that bridge diverse voices and perspectives. And it is this civic infrastructure that amplifies the voices of its people as leaders of their communities to reimagine a future with equitable economic opportunity. Now, you and I met when you were in city government many, many years ago.
30 years ago.
Yeah.
But who's counting?
You also have private practice experience. You sit on multiple very large Fortune 100 boards and not-for-profit boards, and you now run a not-for-profit foundation. Having worked in all these sectors, can you talk a little about how you've been able to build strong coalitions across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors that bridge diverse voices and fundamentally change systems for the better?
Yeah, so Suzanne, let me begin at the beginning of my career in the public sector, which was 35 years ago plus, where I worked for the city of Chicago, and I had been practicing law at a large law firm, bored to tears, sorry if there are any lawyers at large firms here, and I had a baby, and I thought, my goodness, is she ever gonna really be proud of me the way I am of my mom? And so I took this leap of faith and joined local government working for Mayor Harold Washington. He was the first black mayor of Chicago, and when I listened to him on the campaign trail, I felt like he wanted to build a city that I would feel like I was a part of. And honestly, I never really felt a part of Chicago other than my own little neighborhood growing up. And he had this inclusive personality, gregarious. He spoke in like 5-syllable words that were actually words, and they made sense. And so he drew me to government. And I showed up with a little bit of I'm from the government, I gave up a very high-paying job, you should be grateful I'm here to help you. And I would go out into neighborhoods, and they would read that. And let's say it did not go over very well. And I had a lesson really early about listening, regardless of the decibel of the voice that somebody was using. If I was in their community talking about ways of improving their community, first best is to listen to what they wanted. And first I practiced law, and then I moved to the mayor's office, and part of my job there was people would come in demanding to see the mayor, and they got me. Believe me, consolation prize, right? Imagine how angry you are to show up at City Hall demanding to see the mayor. And I would go out and I would put my arm around them and I would listen to their problem, and it was my job to solve their problem. And I learned the skill of 24/7. People would come up to me in the grocery store and the dry cleaners. They would slip notes to my 6-year-old in her carriage. And you can't get away from your constituents when it's local. And what a great lesson about public service and the role of government. And I also learned that when you show up, people don't just trust you because of your title. They trust you when they get to know who you are. And so you have to be open and tell them your story and get to know them. And none of those things did I do when I was in the private practice of law. And it was uncomfortable. And I realized it's just like any other relationship you have. You have to really get to know people. And trust when you are in government is something you have to earn every single day. And so I say these are some of the lessons I learned at the local level because it ties into the work I've done throughout my career, which is to try to build good offices where people feel safe. And they can come in and they can have very different views, but know that their views are going to be heard. We did that in our community development work in Chicago, where we had people who were trying to redevelop a neighborhood and lifelong residents wanted one thing, developers coming into the community wanted something else, banks had their criteria, business had their criteria, and we had to just get in a room and stay in a room multiple times over and over and over again to say, all right, this is a comprehensive plan. And then once you have a plan, you can go out and market your plan. And people don't have to worry about coming in and things change. Right. And so I say this to you, Suzanne, and to Rip, because these are some of the lessons I learned at the local level that were very helpful in the federal government, where we were trying to do really big things, but they affected individual people's lives. And we wanted to always make sure that those individual people had a voice in our decision making. And part of my job in the White House was to make sure that the stakeholders, whether they were advocacy groups or the business community or state and local elected officials or just ordinary citizens who were going to be impacted, had a seat at the table. And that work is not easy. And I know you both know that, having been through this yourselves, and it just takes a sustained effort over time. And you have to be resilient, and you have to sit through meetings where people think, well, they'll never speak to each other again, and you invite them back, and they show back up. And that's part of the civic infrastructure. And the final opening comment I will make is that change requires sustained effort over time. And one of my worries about young people today is they expect everything to happen immediately, and they're used to their community being in the palm of their hand as opposed to putting roots down where they live. And when I was young, if I left the house and I was naughty in a store, my mom heard about it before I got home because the storekeeper knew my mother. And we're losing a little bit of that fabric today. And so trying to figure out how to bring young people who are going to be the leaders of tomorrow in and give them this sense of responsibility and commitment to their community, to their city, to their state, to the country, so that that becomes the civic infrastructure of tomorrow is really important. Final point on this is that it is much easier doing all that at the local level in a political environment. Because in Chicago, you probably just might assume the mayor is a Democrat, but it doesn't really matter because he's the mayor of the city. And when you're local, you can't really afford the luxury of having party warfare because, again, you're looking at your constituents every single day. And so the politics and the toxicity is more theater than real because you have constituents who are right there keeping you accountable. And I think holding those lessons dear as you go through different levels of government. And it's also an important lesson for, I think, for civil society, philanthropic community, and business to realize that these changes that we're talking about, these bridges that we want to build, don't get solidified overnight because trust doesn't get solidified overnight.
You know, so interesting, Valerie. Last year we had Richard Florida come in, and he talked about Michigan as a state that has sort of a portfolio of cities. You know, Traverse City is different from Detroit, is different from Lansing, is different from Holland, is different from Ann Arbor. So how do you take that sort of ethic of local problem solving and sort of aggregate it up? I mean, I think we just heard from the governor. I mean, she's doing a superb job of trying to pull threads together, but it's tough when you have very different political environments, very different partisan environments. And how do you stitch?
You stitch it by bringing them all together. And I think you have a fabulous governor. And if you think about, we were talking backstage about attracting business to Michigan. The governor is the ambassador, but she needs to know that she's supported by the Kresge Foundation, by business leaders, by advocates, by people who want to see their state improve so that she has that wind at her back. But she's a terrific ambassador, and if you look around the country, the states that are luring new businesses in tend to have a really superb governor who's pro-business, which doesn't mean they're anti-something else. It just means that they understand that the economic engine needs to be fueled by the private sector. Government should do its role, civil society should do its role, but you do need that private investment if you want to see sustainable change. Because I don't believe it's the government's role to be there permanently subsidizing. They should fuel the pump and get it going, and then get out of the way and let the market go forward and be there to, create affordable housing, make sure that there's job training, make sure that the schools are good, that the parks are well kept up, that the police force is working. That role is important and ongoing. But in terms of a jump start of business, it's a front end. And the rest of it, business needs to have confidence that not only is this a good place to do business, but that the people who work in that place of business are going to have all of the wonderful qualities of a healthy community that they need in order to attract the talent to make the business work.
Can you talk a little, you now run the Obama Foundation. Can you talk a little about what role philanthropy can play in this hodgepodge of bringing groups together?
Well, our mission at the Obama Foundation is to inspire, empower, and connect the next generation of leaders. And so I have the incredible good fortune of spending a lot of my day with young leaders who are from all over the world and the United States, who are committed to leading in their community, and they are all on the ground. Some of them have run for office at local or state level, at the comparable internationally, but most of them are right there on the ground. And so part of what I see philanthropy doing is getting in there and figuring out how to fill the gap. So oftentimes philanthropy will come in when the private sector won't, when the private sector isn't quite ready. But it gives confidence to the private sector, as you know, Rip, from your work. When they know you're involved in a community, they're much more likely to say, well, you've done the due diligence, you are from the community, you know what we're getting into, and you can be a perfect ambassador as well. And so I think that philanthropy is there to provide good offices, to provide the resources that the private sector is not willing to play, to take risks that the private sector isn't prepared to do, that sets the table for those dollars to come in that will leverage the philanthropic dollars and go further. And so we spend the dollars that we raise to help train this next generation of leaders. We're building an extraordinary campus on the south side of Chicago. Anyone who's in Chicago in 2 years, come on by. We're going to open about 2 years from now, and it's much more than a presidential museum. We're going to have a Chicago Public Library because we want the kids in the community to feel like there's a place for them to go. We're going to have a forum building for gatherings, local and international. We're going to have an athletic center where we're not just going to have sporting events, but teach young people about the skills that they need that they can get through athletics that will help them throughout their career. A vegetable garden, walking trails, sledding hill. Anyone who knows Chicago, it's very flat. Michelle Obama said as a kid she always wanted to go sledding, so we're going to have a sledding hill for her and for the kids. But it's a real amenity to the community. It's on the south side, adjacent to the Museum of Science and Industry and the University of Chicago, and it is really the biggest economic engine project in Chicago, and we are building it with contractors and workers who represent the community in which we are building. And so that's breaking all kinds of models as well, which we think will be a national model for how you build inclusively and thoughtfully as you enter a community.
Could you say just...
My elevator pitch.
Yeah. Well, I had the pleasure of visiting the campus a month or so ago, and it's this extraordinary combination of using the reputational excellence of a former president to sort of project into the next generation a sense of hope and optimism and activism, and yet so deeply rooted in place. I mean, the south side of Chicago has defied a lot of attempts to try to bring it to a different, more hopeful place, and it sure seems that if you're ever going to take a big bet on the south side of Chicago, it would be the administrative and recreational and all of the other activities on that site. One of the things, though, I would love to have you talk about is how that sort of sense of optimism, again, just sort of percolates up. I mean, it's one thing to sort of energize your extraordinary scholars on site. It's another to even sort of help turn the page on the south side of Chicago. But at some point, it's got to sort of get into our water system. And I think one of the challenges that we have as a conference is that we come back year after year after year and try to sort of work an agenda that is clearly in the shared common interest. And yet it's sort of getting increasingly difficult. People aren't talking to one another. People aren't working on projects at the national level in the same way they were. If you were to advise Michigan on what it could be doing better, what would that be?
Well, look, first of all, we cannot give up. There's a lot at stake right now in this kind of polarizing, toxic climate, political climate in which we're all trying to survive and thrive. And I do think that the strength is on the ground. And I think that one of the things that I have observed here in Michigan, and I said this earlier, your reputation outside of Detroit, outside of Michigan, is great. People think Detroit is coming back, they think the state is doing great, and part of it is because you have people from outside of Detroit who have invested money here, who go around talking about how great that investment was around the country. So kind of drink your own Kool-Aid a little bit and appreciate how great this is and talk about it and broadcast it. And I think one of the qualities that we try to instill in our young leaders, Rep, is to make an impact. And how do you take a great idea to scale? And I know if you look around Michigan, there is so much that is working. And the question is, how do you take those best practices from serving 50 people or 100 people or 1,000 people and take it to scale? And what are the evidence-based strategies that you know work? And that's, again, where I know you fund a lot of these organizations that are just doing that work. And then you've got to talk about that work, and you've got to market it, and you've got to convince people that this is an evidence-based strategy. And people want to be associated with what works. They want to feel like they're making an impact. They want to know that their resources, their time, their energy is well spent. And I think right now it is so easy to recoil into your own kind of comfortable place, because to come out of it can be really uncomfortable. Believe me, I know, having been out there. You face a lot of incoming if you say, you know, the sky is blue. Somebody's going to disagree with you right now. And so you have to have a tough skin, and you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think this is some place where philanthropy and government can be very helpful. When I worked in the Obama administration, we had a lot of contentious issues, to say the least. And I would invite people in who would call me one-on-one and scream and yell about somebody else, and then the next person would scream and yell about the other person. But when you put them all in the room together and you say, these are the rules, this is how we're going to, these are our rules of engagement, if you will. And they're actually looking at the person who they were trash talking the day before, they're not as likely to do it. And so what you want to do is appeal to people's better angels. And the better angels are in all of us. And I think, unfortunately, just so much of what we see in media and social media is so negative that you lose sight of the positive. And so my advice is accentuate the positive. Don't be Pollyannish about the challenges, but go forth with the strength. And there is so much strength in this state. My goodness, I've never been to Mackinac Island before. How could that be? I'm from Chicago. It's right next door. And, you know, from tourism perspective, come and get the people. And I'm going to go back and tell everybody how great this is. And that's kind of the attitude, is people who come here need to have a good experience. And I don't mean just here, I mean in the state. And then they're going to go out and talk about it. And that's how change happens, but rooted on the ground.
Valerie, I don't think many people know that you weren't born in this country, that you were born in Iran.
I was.
Can you talk a little about how that has informed your perspectives as you've taken all these different big roles?
Yes. So you're saying to yourself, why was she born in Iran? Believe me, many people have asked that question. So my parents, my dad's from Washington, my mom's from Chicago. They met, they fell in love. My father's a physician. He joined the Army when he finished his residency. And then he wanted to go into academic medicine. And as a black doctor in the 50s, he couldn't find a job at a major academic teaching hospital. And so he and my mother started looking for opportunities outside of the United States. And they were young and a bit crazy, I will say. They would be comfortable with me calling them that. And so at that point, those of you who are not history buffs, the United States and Iran had very strong diplomatic ties. And the Shah of Iran was very interested in improving healthcare and infrastructure. Those were kind of his two big focuses that I was told about. And so he was building, through his health department, hospitals around the country. And my father was offered this job to help start the first hospital, major hospital in Shiraz, Iran. And off they went. They had barely been out of the United States. They didn't speak the language. They didn't know anything about the culture. They just knew that this place was offering my dad an opportunity that was not available to him in this country. And I was the second baby born in that hospital. They practiced on some other baby first. Not sure what happened there, but I did come along successfully. And we lived there till I was 5. And we lived on a hospital compound that was comprised of families from all over the world. And so as a child, I spoke English, I spoke French, I spoke Farsi, sometimes all in the same sentence. And I learned really 4 very important lessons. Number 1, that people are people. And that I am confident that if I walk into a room, I am going to find something in common with whoever's in that room. I don't care where they're from. I don't care what their political party is. We're going to find something in common, because that was the experience I had in this hospital compound. 2, the people who have not lived out of the United States take a lot for granted. My mother boiled everything I ate. She peeled everything, boiled everything I drank, peeled everything I ate, worried about illnesses. My father did research the likes of which he could not have done in this country. And so we should appreciate what we have here. And although the United States is an extraordinary country, it's not actually the only country on earth. And you can learn a great deal outside of your shores if you're willing to listen. And not only did we live in Iran for 5 years, and we moved to London for a year, and then during summers, when I wanted to go to summer camp, my parents would take me all through Africa and the Middle East and back to Iran. And it made me very shy, because when I came back, I didn't really want to tell this story about going from Ghana to Nigeria to Kenya to Ethiopia to Egypt and then Iran. I wanted to talk about being at summer camp with the boys. And so I kind of recoiled from that history, and nobody had ever heard of Iran when we moved to the United States. And the reason we ended up back in the United States is the research my dad did in Iran caught the attention of researchers at the Galton Labs at University College of London. And so he and my mom went there for 1 year. And there he gave a paper at some international conference, and it caught the attention of the dean of the University of Chicago Medical Center. Now, the University of Chicago is located in the neighborhood where my grandmother and my mother's sister and 4 of her first cousins all live. And they offered my father a job that was not available to him 6 years earlier when they left, or 7 years earlier when they left. And so he would say to me growing up that sometimes the shortest distance to where you want to go means you better be prepared to take the scenic route, because he had certainly taken the scenic route. And so that was really the 4th lesson, I think. And those early years really shaped a lot of what I did in local government, where I could be meeting with a CEO, trying to keep them in the city or get them to build a plant, or I could be meeting with a resident of public housing who was worried about safety for her child. And I felt comfortable wherever I went. And I think in those White House years, where we had so many thorny, complicated issues that had various stakeholders, often who disagreed, I was willing to sit down and meet with anyone who was going to help us get things done. And so I met with the general counsel of Koch Industries. Koch Industries worked really hard to ensure Barack Obama was not elected president, not once but twice. But the general counsel cared about criminal justice reform. And I discovered he has a lovely wife who cared about a diversion program for girls of color in Wichita, and I went with her to Wichita, none of which would have, and it was a day I'll never forget, meeting those young women. And it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been willing to hear Mark's story. I worked with Rupert Murdoch on immigration reform. Well, I don't have to say much about Rupert Murdoch and how he felt about President Obama. But my point is that all these people are people. And if you sit down and you work with them, and I got a lot of blowback from my progressive friends who are like, why would you be meeting with Mark Holden? Why would you be? And I say, because Mark has votes that I don't have on criminal justice reform. And I need those votes. And I need to be able to come up with a package that is acceptable to people who have a different perspective than I do. Because that's how change actually happens. In a big, complicated, pluralistic democracy such as ours, we have to build a big tent that has to be inclusive. And I can disagree with you on 99 issues and work with you on 1. And then begin to work with you on 2. And then to begin to work with you on 3. That's how I think change happens.
You said in your book that if you had advice to someone sort of starting out in a career, it would be to be curious, be adventuresome, zigzag a little bit, not always sort of follow a straight line. Would you give the same advice to a state?
To be curious, absolutely, to people. I mean, look, the subtitle for my paperback, well, the title was Finding My Voice. And the subtitle of my paperback was When the Perfect Plan Crumbles, the Adventure Begins. And when I finished Michigan Law School, I had this plan of going back to Chicago and practicing law and figuring out how to be a partner at a law firm and getting married and having a child, all by 31, 10 years after finishing college. And I checked all those boxes, and except the last box was live happily ever after. And I realized I didn't like my job, didn't like my husband. I did like my child, I'm holding on to her. But it all kind of crumbled, and I felt, to be really honest with you, I felt like a failure. And I was like, I married the boy next door. My mom and his mom grew up in the same apartment building. Our dads were friends. I'd had a crush on him since I was 8 and he was 12. What could go wrong? Well, plenty, and it did. But I had to kind of say, just because the marriage failed didn't define me. And I actually learned, I'm just telling you all everything. I just learned, it's all in my book, so that there's nothing lonelier than being in an unhappy marriage. And I had this preconceived childhood notion that I would get married and that somehow that would make me happy. And I realized that what made me happy was being really competent at what I did so I could be a role model for my daughter. And when she was about 7.5 months pregnant, I finished my book and she was interviewed with me. And somebody said to her, "What did you learn about your mom in the book that you didn't already know?" And she said, "I had no idea how guilty my mother felt when I was young." Because I always, as many of you working moms feel, more so than working dads, like you're not good at anything because you're trying to do everything, mostly doing it all yourself. And she said, she taught me how to be a working mother. And I'm like, could you have said that 30 years earlier? Why are you saying that now? It would have been really helpful when I was like sweating to get to the Halloween parade. Anyway, I know you had a question in there. Did I answer it?
It was to stick with your family for just a sec. Your daughter, I'm told, is in broadcast journalism.
My daughter practiced law for 6 years, just like I did, even though I said to her, don't. That was her only form of rebellion, which I'm not going to complain about if that's as bad as she gets. And then she swerved, just like I encouraged, and I did, and I encouraged her to do, into journalism. She tried to get a job in local journalism in Chicago. Couldn't because she was a lawyer, not a journalist. And so she ended up landing a job at CNN, covering the Justice Department. She was hired in September of 2016. And so, of course, she thought, well, my mother's going to know the Attorney General, whoever it is under Hillary Clinton, and I'm going to have all these ins, and this is going to be great. And then she walks into the Justice Department with the last name Jarrett. Needless to say, probably not the best calling card, but I give her credit. She earned her way, and she covered the Justice Department, then she moved to New York for 3 more years and anchored the early morning show, 5 a.m., early start on CNN. And now she's two things. She's the senior legal correspondent for NBC News, so she does the Today Show and Nightly News, and then she anchors the Today Show on Saturday morning, and she has definitely found her voice.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Well, when she was growing up, because it was just the two of us and my parents and my extended family, I used to say there's an expression, you're only as happy as your least happy child. And so I would say I've got all my eggs in one basket. So be happy. Figure out how to make yourself happy was my advice to her. Yeah. And give me grandchildren, which she's done. Thank you.
So we have been working on, last year at this conference, it was announced we were going to have a Grow Michigan Council, trying to figure out how to bring more population within our borders and keep young talent, which has been tough for the new knowledge economy, which we expect to be created. So as we think about the next generation, what advice can you give us on providing an environment that will keep young talent within our borders here and have a more vibrant community?
You've got to talk to them. And look, I am old now, and so I realize that I have a lot to learn from them. I think they could learn a little from me as well. But part of what we do with our leaders when they first start on our program is we listen to them and we tell us, like, what makes you tick? What do you care passionately about? What goes through your mind as you're trying to think about how you want to make an impact? And I think the same thing applies, like, what does a city need to provide in order to make you happy? Chicago had a huge outward migration to the suburbs in, say, the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s, it started to come back. Why? Because we built a very vibrant downtown, and we had nightclubs and restaurants, and we revitalized the theater district. And so it not only drew young people, but it drew old people who lived in the suburbs, raised their children, and then wanted to move back in the city. And now we have an issue with crime, and so it's becoming a real challenge to keep hold. We have, so in a sense, the same challenge. But from what I heard, your population in Detroit is now growing, but a lot of the black people are moving to the suburbs, and the more affluent white people are moving in. And so the question is, how do you keep the mix? Because I think cities, part of the magic of cities is their diversity, the richness of their diversity. And I love in Chicago, you could go to, anywhere in the world has a restaurant in Chicago, from that ethnicity. And that's part of what makes young people excited, is that they are curious, they are interested in exploring. And so looking at it through their lens, Suzanne, is I think part of how the first step in figuring out how to keep them there. And then just the basics of when they get married or they just have children, they need to know that their kids have a place to go to school. They need to get a good education, be safe, have a place to play. That's how families make decisions, I think, about where they want to be. And young people, let's face it, can be anywhere. Thanks to the good thing about technology is, of course, you can be anywhere and communicate with people. The bad thing about technology is you can just be in your basement on your computer and never come outside. And so trying to accentuate the positives of it and figure out how to make that work and still have this sense of place, I think, is the challenge. And we're all kind of trying to work our way through that as we're in the middle of this technological revolution.
Absolutely. Well, sage advice, we could talk all day. Unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you so much.
You
Let's
are
give
welcome.
a big hand
Thank
to Valerie
you.
Jarrett.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.